Well, Amanda, I appreciate you being here with me on the Social Entrepreneurship and Innovation podcast. And for
It
folks,
is my pleasure.
thank you. And for folks who are unfamiliar, would you mind sharing with us a little bit as to who you are and what it is that you do?
Sure. So I'm Australian. So I'm coming to you from the other side of the planet. I guess you could say I've had a career in different forms of social change and exploring what makes social change powerful. Across my sort of 20 years in this space, I've been involved in lots of social movements. I've set up some new organizations. I set up an organization called GetUp, which is like Move On in the United States with some colleagues. And then I also set up an organization called the Sydney Alliance, which is part of the Industrial Areas Foundation, which was a network that was founded in Chicago in the 1930s by Saul Alinsky. And so I've done a lot of organizing, and also I have researched organizing. So oddly, during my career, I've taken time out to do a PhD and then a postdoctoral fellowship researching social change. I know it's just not a traditional route, but that's okay. I have enjoyed the time in sort of reflecting on social change. And then because no one reads books, tragically, I also produce a podcast on social change that sort of unpacks some of my research and thinking, but most importantly, I go around the world. Well, I used to go around the world. Now I call people on Skype around the world and report stories and campaigns of social change to sort of identify and articulate some of the lessons that we're seeing in what makes change work.
Yeah, when the world allows, maybe once more, you can globetrot once again.
Yeah, we cross our fingers, but I'm not holding my breath.
Sure. And so I'd love to start a little bit as to where such a passion and drive for social change has come from within you. And I mean, because you're involved in both sides, it seems historically of being so active within it, but as well studying it and looking at it from, more of an overview and that research type perspective. So I'd be curious to hear of some of the origins of this and why it's been such an inclination for you.
Sure. So look, we always talk in organizing that our stories don't start when we're born, they start way before that. And I have to say that my grandma, who used to look after me a lot when I was a kid and used to tell me lots of stories about how the world worked, and she grew up in World War II and the bombs were falling, but also her father was killed for gambling debts, and they were homeless. And she got a very serious understanding of what side she was on in terms of the political battles of life that she shared with me when I was young. And I feel like that was in some ways like a foundational moment, a formation moment in my political awareness, like even more so than my parents. The sort of voice of my grandmother, rippled through me as I looked at the world and examined the world. And I was always a bit of a nerd, and she would bring that out in me too. Like she would buy me books at a place called St. Vincent's de Paul, which is like a charity shop in the downtown, and she would buy these books, and she would sort of literally feed my interest in the world, and she would reflect on her own experience and political outlook. So that's like, I think that is hugely important. Like I had that from a very young age. It gave me a curiosity. So when I went to university, I hadn't been particularly involved in stuff. I'd sort of reached out, but I felt like an outsider. My direct family weren't involved in anything political. And so I didn't really know who to talk to or what to do before I got to university. But university is like a great catalyzing experience for whatever you want to do, really. And for me, I was looking out for social change stuff, and I got involved in the student movement. Then in Australia, there was a massive rise in fees to university. And my dad in Australia also, we had free education for 20 years. Bizarre, beautifully bizarre.
Crazy idea.
Anyone could actually go, right? Working class kids could actually go to university. And my dad was one of them. And when the fees started rising, I was kind of alarmed at what that would mean, not just theoretically, but actually like for people like my father, or even like me who only for accessible education could be able to go.
Mm.
And so I threw myself into the student movement. And in many ways, like that was 21 years ago, and I haven't looked back since that time. But I guess I just want to throw out, that's not the only reason why I got involved in social change. The other one is that when I was 19, I had a massive health scare, and I wasn't sure I was going to recover. And it was, and I'm happy to talk about it, which that it's one of those health scares that it comes with a lot of stigma. I have bipolar, and I had a psychosis when I was 19, and it was terrifying for me and my family. But as I recovered, my older dreams, which were I was going to go become a lawyer and make arguments for social justice, like some sort of Boston legal law and order moment, which was sweet but fairly limited. Those things fell away for me, and I decided that my life was going to be about making a difference in the time that I had, because I wasn't sure how much time I would necessarily have. The doctors never thought that I would recover, and I did recover, and I ended up not only taking that passion around the student movement forward, but I became the president of the National Union of Students. And it was sort of through, I don't know, I think that I had a very firm and clear sense of what I wanted to achieve in the world from having such a health crisis early on in my life. And I've carried that through my life.
That's really interesting. I'm wondering as well, just because there are so many young people who perhaps feel impassioned by a particular moment or a context, affecting them personally, or as well as some greater community that they're a part of, but they don't necessarily know what might be like the next action to kind of continue to fuel that passion. And so I'm wondering if you have any sort of advice or thoughts on some young person now, feeling very emboldened about anything in particular. Like what do you recommend for them to get stuck into something, or to like take a next step to kind of further, what would be influencing some sort of change?
So I think, look, action and reflection are two sides of the same coin. And I think that there's not nearly enough reflection, not enough culture of reflection or evaluation in a lot of social change organizations. And frankly, everywhere. I don't think there's a lot of
Sure.
active and healthy reflection in our corporate community either, right? And certainly not in our political community. I think the culture of thinking and taking a step back, casting the mirror back on ourselves, is an incredibly important one. And I know for those involved in social change, especially in the first sort of 5 or 10 years of your involvement in social change, say, and especially now where there's sort of such an awareness of the toxicity of racism or the crisis of our planet, as well as an economic crisis and a health crisis, it can feel like everything is urgent and we don't have time to think, right? And I guess my caution to people feeling that is that is a word of caution. Social change has to be seen. I mean, John L. Lewis said this too, right? He said this too last, he's recently passed, and he made the comment that social change is like a marathon, a lifelong commitment for change. It's not a singular moment, a singular episode, a singular adrenaline moment. It's long. Saul Alinsky, the godfather of community organizing, similarly talked about, he says this passage in this book, Rules for Radicals, where he talks about you're climbing a mountain, and that's like your campaign, right? So you're in the middle of this campaign, say a climate change campaign, and you're climbing the mountain, and then you think you've got to the top, and then the clouds part, and actually you realize that you're not at the top, you're just at a bluff, and then you've got to keep on climbing, right? So you've got to climb up to the next bit of the mountain, and the clouds part, same on, right? That's what social change is about. So we need to get match fit when it comes to doing this kind of work. And we know what match fit looks like if you're playing sport, but when it comes to social change, it's actually about a culture of reflection and evaluation, a culture of still as well as action. You need both. And I feel like that's something that my brain actually, like my bipolar, has helped me with that, because I have a zeal for action. Others might call it mania. And I also have a capacity for stillness. Others might call it depression. And because I can't keep running, right? Like my body is physically incapable of running. I break if I run too fast. And so I've had to learn how to run and slow. And I feel that that actually has been a gift. Like there are many gifts that come from a seeming adversity, and that's definitely a gift I've had from my seeming adversity. So I was involved in the student movement, running along, and then I got involved in a refugee movement. Australia's a very racist place. We're awful to refugees. We're not the only ones who don't like migrants, but
Sure.
Jesus, we're really awful sometimes. And I was involved in that space. Then the war in Iraq happened, got involved in that space. And by that point, I was pretty burnt out. And I'd also had this experience of working in coalition with lots of organizations in a way that I thought was really interesting, but also had real limits. And I ended up, that's when I went and did my PhD, because I did my PhD on that question that I'd been wrestling with, which is how do organizations work together? This question of how do we make powerful coalitions? So, the changes in my life have in part come, changes in pathway and direction. The thing I've done next, like you asked, the thing I've done next has often come out of a consequences of thinking of the thing that's not working now and having enough time to think about not just how cool and fun it is to be involved in social change, because it is, but also what's missing in order for us to really win. And I don't mean answering that question in a dogmatic or ideological way, right? Like in a way that other people have answered before. I mean, coming up with original thought about what's not working and pursuing, like not necessarily having the answer, but just at least having the question and pursuing some thinking along those questions. And that's what I think if all of our people who are involved in social change have that reflective capacity, we will be so much stronger, because we're all leaders. We're not looking to some, hero on the mount to lead us out of this cataclysmic disaster that we're in at the moment. My goodness, and the best social movements at the moment are leaderful, right? They're very grassroots and they're very decentralized. Okay, well, that comes with responsibility. Leaders think and reflect, not just do. So we need to do that.
And so where do you feel now yourself with the research that you do, and as well with the podcast you host and the trainings as well that y'all host, where do you feel like your position is or your role is in this space of social change now?
So I like to think of myself as a teacher and a mentor. Sometimes when I'm working with the climate student strikers, they're one of this magnificent movement, very large in Australia. I tell them that I'm like Yoda and they're like my young apprentice. And, they're allowed to disagree, but, I'm so old and I've been doing this for so long, and, they could ask me, there's no dumb questions, and I'm happy to just sit and talk. And I actively cultivate mentoring relationships with lots of people, particularly young women, but not exclusively, but mainly young women, and often people of color, because I just feel like they've had less opportunities for mentoring than others. And I run a whole bunch of training courses. Indeed, we set up a training course through ChangeMakers during the pandemic. It was called Organizing During a Pandemic, and we trained 900 people on a weekly basis through Zoom, everyone watching in from their homes. It's still going, it's 14 weeks in. I just have this appetite for teaching. I guess that's why I did the podcast. Like for me, it's not enough to just think. It's actually about thinking about how we have to change the world. It was said before by great people, and it's needed again. I'm not that kind of person working at a university who just thinks that that's enough. It's not enough to have novel ideas. You have to be responsible for carrying them through into practice. But I like to think of myself as a teacher. And it's interesting, like that came out of reflection. I remember years ago, sort of it emerging to me, that's what I love doing. I love teaching. I love engaging in learning moments. And I think everyone's got different gifts, right? So part of it is about thinking about what is it that you're reasonably good at, but also that just fills you with joy and energy, that you could wake up and do every day of the week. And then you're starting to have a think about what's your vocation, which is, for me, is teaching.
And so perhaps it's along similar lines of what you share with these some 900 pupils in that training, or some of the other folks that you mentor. But maybe going deeper into what are some of these lessons that you're attempting to communicate in advising and offering mentorship in the space of social change for these young change makers?
Yeah. Well, I think that change is something that happens at three scales. Change is personal, change is organizational, and change is society-wide. And actually all are important, right? So good social change does all of those three things productively. And if you're not doing all of those things, actually, it's kind of not working. Like just personal change, like, oh, look, I've got a keep cup. Oh, look, I'm not using water bottles or something. Like, fine. Like, I'm not dissing it. I'm just saying it's not nearly enough, right? We can't do things on our own. So organizations become important. And I don't mean rigid organizations necessarily. Like there's a lot of loose and new kinds of organizational forms that have sort of evolved in the last sort of 15 years, particularly with digital. And that's great. But we need a group. We need a gang. We need to be able to engage in learning and practice and change with others. And so there needs to be a question of how we're working together with others. And that's a question of organization. And then society. Like it's not good enough, right, to just have a sweet organization and nice personal practice and society goes to shit, right? We need to make social change as well. So I think that whenever we're looking at social change, we're looking at, very simplistically those three scales, right? Your group, your personal hood, but also society as a whole. In terms of social change, look, there's heaps of books that people can read and there are different philosophies. I guess some of my work, I started off looking at questions of how do we get people to work together? That seemed like an obvious one, actually fundamentally difficult. And I did a whole lot of thinking and practice on coalition building. So I did this PhD and book on coalition building called Power in Coalition. I lived in the US for a couple of years. And then I came having sort of from the research that I'd done, but also from building a relationship with this group called the Industrial Areas Foundation, that actually I think that you're in and around Texas, like there's huge networks connected to the Industrial Areas Foundation in Texas, actually, like COPS, which is based in San Antonio, is one of their leading networks.
It's my hometown. A lot of people
haven't. Yeah, there you go. So this network is really vibrant. It's been around since 1940, but it's been particularly vibrant since the 1970s. And I brought it to Australia because no one had done that before, right? Like sometimes an idea needs a carrier. Someone needs to literally physically take an idea and bring it somewhere else. And that was practicing coalitions using a different kind of philosophy. And the different philosophy was about focusing on relationships. And so it was really an intense focus on relationships and how to build powerful relationships and slowing things down to be able to speed up change, slowing things down to allow for very different groups of people to come together rather than just pulling together the same old gang, which is a limit in many organizations, is that you just keep working with the same people rather than with people who are different to you, who challenge you. And that was community organizing is beautiful. And at one level, people could go off and research community organizing. But I did that for 10 years, set up this organization. It's still around, Sydney Alliance, and there's a whole network across the country. But I also started to feel that it wasn't enough, that actually there's a real propensity in the social change world to take on a theory of change or a philosophy for change, like whether it's community organizing or mobilizing or even direct action or whatever it is, and to then poo-poo everyone else, right? Like, well, I've got it right and you've got it wrong, and vice versa. People who in the Democrats, for instance, or political parties might poo-poo those who are nonpartisan, who might poo-poo those who do more leaderful activism, like we're seeing with Black Lives Matter at the moment, right? And I just started to go, this seems really stupid. Like this is antithetical to the kind of coalition practice that I had researched previously, but I wasn't really sure how to come at the question. So this postdoc that I've just completed, we're about to put out a new book, looked at, rather than seeing these different strategies of mobilizing or organizing or parties or prefigurative action where you sort of model the change you want to see, or even playing by the rules, right? Traditional advocacy. rather than seeing them in competition, we're making an argument that actually they are they can be partnered strategies for social change anywhere. And we're looking at cities, but anywhere. And then actually, if you look closely at most forms of social change, they migrate through these different pathways in really interesting ways. And actually, you don't need to do all of them yourself, but if you're in relationship with people who, like if I'm in a great, beautiful community organizing network and I'm in relationship with some people who are engaged in transforming a majority political party in a city, and then someone else is doing some mass mobilization, rather than seeing ourselves in competition with each other, that actually, if we can be sophisticated in our relational work, that we can collaborate. It's not easy to collaborate. There's actually cultural tensions between these different practices, but I'm a big believer that we need to all work together. The problems are too big for us to solve on our own. And I keep coming at by thinking about social change in that way. How do we work out how to work together better?
And so I suppose it's that which you prescribe some of these more young and still very ambitious change makers to take a deeper look at is where might be some more opportunities for collaboration with folks of different modalities and sectors and spaces.
So I'd say two things to anyone who is coming into social change. I would say, firstly, thank God you are going to push us old people around, and that is exactly what we need. When I was young, I did the same thing to oldies, and I expect nothing less of people who are coming in their teens and their 20s to push us around and teach us what's possible, because the stakes for their lives around climate change, but equally issues like racism, what's going on with the economy, what's going on with their pandemic are heightened. They've got a clearer sense of what they need, and they don't see as many obstacles as oldies like I do, right? So their job is to do that. But they also, with ambition comes grace, right? You don't know everything, right? No one knows everything. I wouldn't dare to suggest I know everything. So with on the gracious side is thinking about how can we build those sort of creative relationships with others so we can learn more, because none of us know enough. Like the arrogance is a quality of our enemy, right? That's a quality of, we see that with with your president, right? With the president. We have to be conscious of our values when we're building our movements, and caution ourselves against any practice that would that would connect with that. Like we have to be open, we need to be learning, we need to be creative, all that sort of stuff. It's not easy. Like I'm not suggesting it's easy, but if you're not challenged, then you're not trying. So if the social change you're doing feels easy, both in terms of its mode, not just in terms of its goal, like no one's suggesting that goals of social change are easy, but I mean in the practice, like if you're just working with people who are really similar to you, we need to work with people who are similar. We also need to work with people who are different. So that would be my invitation, is to be just feeling that tension between those two things.
And so I guess further along that, given the context that we are in, so acutely affected by the pandemic among us, I imagine people will hear this as well, hopefully when the pandemic world has passed us in some degree, but climate devastation, systemic inequalities, where is the gap? Is it that sort of creative exploration, seeking out people who are a bit less similar or a bit similar than you? Is that where we need to go to be able to achieve much of the change that we'd like to live in a more ideal world for us?
So I think we're at one of those moments where we get to create the future that not every generation gets, right? It last happened 100 years ago, where there was this level of openness about how to rewrite the rules. And so let's get our brains on and be ambitious about the kind of rule writing that we're going to do. Let's try and not be we'll be scared, but let's not be too scared to really think ambitiously about what is needed, not just what is possible, but also what's needed. People might not be able to calculate how to make something politically possible, but if we need to keep temperatures at 1.5 degrees to stop climate change, then we kind of just need to make that happen,
Right.
rather than feel like, oh, well, it's not politically calculable today, so we can't possibly do it. It's like we need to hold these things together. Um, like, or defund the police, right?
Mm.
I reckon a bunch of people would have gone, oh, that seems crazy. Well, actually, maybe it's exactly what we need. Maybe it's
Mm.
exactly what we need, and now we need to make it happen, right? Same sort of thing. Um, what I would say, where I'm at, I'm in the middle of looking at this Green New Deal or green stimulus stuff. We've been working with some of the, in my work at the university, we've built a big coalition of not-for-profit organisations and unions and corporates to consider this question in Australia, inspired by the work that we've seen Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others do in the US, and it's a global movement. But we've got to everyone's got to translate it for their own circumstance. The one thing, so we're thinking too about what do we need in this, what does the economy need in this moment?
Mm.
And one of the thoughts that we have is there needs to be massive stimulus, right? And there needs to be an injection and a provision for this role for the state in being able to make life better for people. But it's also more than that. It's not just enough to call for economic intervention. And this question about relationships and collaboration and treating people as equal and reviving the idea of citizenship and not just people as clients or people as consumers, I think needs to be at the center of what we do going forward. So there is a bit of interesting research in this space about what institutions would look like if they saw people as citizens rather than as just, as clients. Like I look at the aged care institutions in everywhere, and they're dangerous. They're dangerous places. Throwing more money at aged care institutions is not going to fix anything. We need to rethink how we do aged care, for instance. And when we rethink how we do aged care, we need to think about things like relationships and people and treating people with dignity. And I think that I think often there's sometimes progressive people get nervous when the debate turns to the economy because they're not sure how to contribute, if they have the language. But actually they have the language. Their language is rooted in their values around practices like relationships, and they should speak with confidence about that's what we need. That stuff is what we need. And let's make an economy that suits that.
I think those are very interesting points. I mean, and it seems to demand quite the cultural transformation, but I mean, perhaps what better moment than now for that to exist?
If not now, when, right? Like, really? It's crazy. Like, not now, when? When are we waiting for?
I know. Yeah. I mean, it's very interesting to see the tone of conversation change. And as well, it's because it's like, a day feels like a month right now, and how all the different actors in society are taking a step one way or another to, whether it's with the Black Lives Matter movement or as well just this all the economic peril and health peril that's ensued from this pandemic. Whether it's corporations saying like taking some particular stance, and then you can very quickly track like, is that actually legitimate? Should that just be considered a marketing ploy? Like where does all this stand? But I mean, it in the absolute seems best light of it is that it's encouraging this sort of conversation to kind of recalibrate with what sort of values we should continue to take on with us. I know that's for sure here in the United States, as we some author's term, but we live in a bit of a market world, as everything all revolves around here, around economic speak. Whether people intellectually believe, they're like, yeah, that seems to make sense, but don't, as you say, kind of grounded in values, don't in fact believe some of these talking points or things that we use to make arguments. So it's a very, very interesting time with that. Yeah. Well, Amanda, I really, really appreciate your time. But before we wrap up, can I ask you a few kind of rapid fire questions or
sure?
Well, I'd love to start with a book, as is kind of a classic podcast question. Any particular books that you've been impacted by recently, or perhaps always come back to recommending for folks interested in diving deeper into the social change space?
Oh, heaps. So I look, this is a classic. feels old and clangy when you read it, but Rules for Radicals, for people who haven't read it, like it's the most widely read social book in the world. You know, I've been to Cape Town and it was on the bookshelf. I've been to Hong Kong and Philippines, everywhere. It's everywhere, right?
Mhm.
And it's hilariously interesting. I think the chapter on tactics, which is particularly interesting, 13 sort of radical ways of thinking about tactics, is particularly helpful. You know, and I think it's virtually nothing if you buy it in the Kindle. Certainly on the ChangeMakers website, we released that chapter for free in breach of whatever, you know, because people should just read it. You know what I mean? It's really creative. I think that, you know, if you look in places like Hong Kong, I also think if you look to places like some of the parts of the Black Lives Matter, those tactics in practice. Good social change embodies a lot of the lessons from that text, consciously or unconsciously, right? So I would suggest that there's a good debate in social change between mobilizing and organizing, and it looking at very confused. And it's as I sort of said, it's used people sling those words at each other's sides. But there are a few good books in that space. Harry Hahn has, I think the book is, his book came out in 2014. It's something like How to Organizations Build Activists. She gives a scholar perspective, but lovely examples. She's a US, like quite a senior now US academic based at Johns Hopkins University in this space. Then there's another book called Collective Bargain by Jane McElvey. It's just come out. She's on the organizing. She gives some really, really interesting analysis about how to make change, and really agitates with those who are less intentional in building social movements. So like it'll rile you up, but it's an interesting book. On the other side, there's a couple. So there's what's it called? Revolutionaries for Radicals, I think it's called, which is by Becky Bond and Zach Exley, who ambitiously seek to stand on the shoulders of Saul Alinsky. You know, people can read it and work out whether they did that or not, but it's still a really interesting book about mobilizing and how to mass mobilize, and gives stories and examples out of 2016 Bernie Sanders campaign. You know, one that came out a little earlier than that is This Is an Uprising by Paul Engler. And it too is really interesting in terms of mobilizing strategies and direct action. I mean, look, there's some of the things that I would throw out for your listeners. I mean, obviously, I think there's a whole bunch of stuff that's happened in the last few years that's really interesting, some of which are recorded as stories in the podcast. Like, you know, like I just don't think you can say you're across social change if you're not across what happened in the Hong Kong protests and what continues to go on there. We've done a series of episodes around that, and I reckon that's something for people to refresh their minds with. Similarly, I think what's gone on in Spain and particularly in Barcelona, and how social change over there after the global financial crisis transitioned through a process of organizing with groups like LA, mobilizing through demonstrations like M15, and then political parties with groups like Barcelona en Comú, whose leader, Ada Colau, is actually the mayor of Barcelona and has been for a couple of years. Like, that story is not well known in the US. It's sort of reasonably well known across Europe and other places, but that's one I would get into. And the first episode of ChangeMakers is on that story because it's just such a cracker story. Anyway, there's some thoughts of things I reckon if people are at home wanting to think about social change, they could think about those ones.
Excellent recommendations. We'll collect all of them and put them in the show notes for sure, especially the podcast. Next question for you. Are there any particular daily habits or routines that you feel like you absolutely have to stick with?
Sure. I do a lot of exercise, so that I find that quite a grounding experience. I am sort of boringly well planned. Like, I have medium-term goals and short-term goals and medium lists and short lists and ticket box lists and stuff like that, which I I think it just gives me, I feel like I take on a few too many tasks sometimes. And I feel like if I don't write it down, I will forget. And so I have developed, especially in the last sort of 5 years, I've tried to develop quite a rigorous planning process, like always doing annual and kind of quarterly plans. And I tend to do, this sounds terrible, I tend to do it often when I'm on holidays, like take a break. Right?
Need that
And
space.
it gives me the space to have a think. Not so much because I'm writing the plan on holidays, but like I'm just taking stock. And so I think that idea of the taking stock, like our plans, if we just keep planning in the same direction and in the environment changes, or even just our thinking changes, then they're not that effective. So the plans have to be dynamic, right? Like I'm not suggesting everyone sits down and writes a 10-year plan for themselves. That would not be very helpful. But a dynamic planning process where you're constantly revisiting them is a good one. I have bipolar. I have to take an enormous amount of medication on a daily basis. So that's a bit of a shit, but it keeps me on the straight and narrow. What else? Oh, and I don't know. I've got two kids and a family, and I make sure I spend time with them, right? You got to prioritize and schedule your private life. Or otherwise no one else will. So I do quite intentionally make time for them. They're not that big, and therefore it's nice to hang out with them. They won't be around forever. So neither will I. So.
And then one more before we finish up. Are there any particular organizations, nonprofits, or otherwise that you'd really like to give a plug for doing some particularly inspirational or exceptional work right now?
I wish I knew who was doing exceptional inspirational work in the US better than I do. Like I know, I mean, there's heaps of great organizations, but I don't think any of them are going to shock your listeners, except for one, which is the Hong Kong Democracy Council. So last year, a friend of mine who's an experienced organizer, a US based guy, Samuel Chu, and we went to Hong Kong together. His dad was one of the leaders of the movement, in the umbrella movement. Previously, he also was in Tiananmen Square. Like the guy's a bloody hero. And Samuel came with me and helped produce these podcast episodes that we broadcast. And then he went back to the US, and as you do when you give a shit and things are going crazy, he set up this American movement to defend the Hong Kongers against human rights abuses. And that led to the passage of the Hong Kong, what's it called? Hong Kong Human Rights Act, I think it's called, which Trump signed, and Nancy Pelosi and everyone embraced. And then now that's the legislation that is being used to respond to the national security law in Hong Kong, in China, like in President Xi's security law. And I would say that of every that organization to support, where there's so many competing interests, so many competing things, and I think that the rise of a despotic People's Republic of China and is a problem, and that is also something that we're not really talking about nearly enough. We're so worried and we're not thinking about the geopolitical. We need to resource some of our people to be thinking about the geopolitical, and the Hong Kong Council, they do that. I would encourage everyone to give pennies and much more to them.
Perfect. We'll have them linked up. And Amanda, very last thing here. Are there any parting asks or parting pieces of advice for the aspiring change makers?
Yeah, just make time to think. Like, what's your reflective practice? Are you keeping a journal? Have you got a habit of checking in with a friend? Have you got a mentor, like a friend or a buddy? Have you got a mentor? Are you taking some time out to do some dedicated reading and maybe even blogging or writing? Are you listening to cool podcasts about these such matters? Of course, that's the most important. No, but think about working on your reflective practice, and then think about how you're going to keep accountable to that. Because it's like, everyone gets excited, goes, oh, I'm going to have a reflective practice, and they have one for like a week. I certainly know this because I do this all the time. What you also need is to build into the plan who's going to help you do it. Like we struggle with accountability. And so who's going to help you do it? So a buddy is the best way, right? Is to have someone you check in with who's a mate and who can help guide you, or a mentor if you can find yourself a mentor. And really the most important thing about a mentor is someone that you click with and that you trust. They can be similar to you, different to you. That's not really, you want someone who's going to push you, but push you in a way that feels safe, but a little bit agitational, because like we want to be challenged. Hopefully, I hope people want to be challenged. Like, I'm not satisfied with the status quo as it is, right? So therefore I want to be challenged, just like I think it needs to be challenged. So, building a reflective practice, I think that's really important.
Brilliant final advice. Well, thank you, Amanda, so much for taking the time.
No, my pleasure. It was lovely to have a chat. Lovely to talk with you about, like, to think of you oriented in the US while I'm oriented here in Australia. It's nice to reconnect globally.